Gentleman from Elliott.
Speaker, I'd move you, sir, to House Bill 211 be taken into place yours today, read for third time by its title and sponsor only and placed upon its passage.
Motion made and motion seconded that House Bill 211 be taken into place orders today, read for third time by its title and sponsor only and placed upon its passage.
House Bill 211, an act relating to energy and declaring an emergency. Representative Thompson.
Gentleman from Elliott.
Speaker, I would yield to the gentleman from Davies 14 for explanation of the bill. Motion thereon.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from Davies.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Ladies and gentlemen of the House, House Bill 211 involves a major industry in Kentucky that has contributed significantly to Kentucky being established as the nation's leading aluminum producing state. But due to a unique set of circumstances, which we'll discuss, this industry is on the precipice of closing and going out of business, thus resulting in the demise of this critical industry in our state, and along with it, thousands of jobs and over $1 billion of economic activity. Now I have to admit that this bill and what it does not do has been the product of an unprecedented campaign of misinformation and distortion and fear-mongering. And that's unfortunate because of what's at stake. And as a result of that, today, and I emphasize the word today, I'm not going to ask for a vote on this bill. I'm going to allow time for some calm, hopefully, to set in and for some correct information to be imparted. And hopefully, before we leave here, that can make a difference on this critical issue to a lot of us in the western part of the state. Now, let me explain the context of this bill quickly to you. This is unique in a number of ways. We're talking about two smelters, two aluminum smelters, two of the few that remain in America that are located in a lot of our districts in western Kentucky. These two smelters represent 70% of the customer base of the utility that provides power to them. Two customers represent 70% of the customer base. Those two customers use an aggregated amount of power every day that's the equivalent of what the city of Louisville supplies in a day. That's how much power they use. Electricity is 45% approximately of their operating cost. And they have to have a 95% load factor. That means that 95% of the time, almost 24/7, they have to utilize the same amount of power. There's no other industry in Kentucky that meets those qualifications, that has that kind of load factor, and we're so reliant on power and the cost of it. Presently, they're paying a rate for their power that's about $15 a megawatt hour higher than what they could purchase it for in the open market. As a result of that, they're on the footsteps of going out of business because they're losing millions, and they legitimately are losing millions of dollars a month. So with that facing them, they've been talking and having negotiations with their power supplier to see if there was a way that those power costs could be reduced to them so that they could stay in business, continue that economic activity, and continue those critical jobs to our region. Unfortunately, they haven't been successful in reaching an agreement on getting a lower rate. So by virtue of what's in their power contract, they have the option to terminate their power contract with the utility supplier. They have exercised that right. Some people have said, well, they breached their contract. I've heard that in the last. They haven't breached their contract at all, just simply because they cannot continue to exist with the rate that they're being afforded by the contract. They exercised a clause to terminate the contract. Now, when they did that, they continued in negotiations with the power supplier to do hopefully something that said, okay, if you can't lower your power to us and therefore we can't stay in business at this rate, how about if we're allowed to go to the open market where we can buy it for about $15 or less, and by virtue of that, we'll be able to stay in business. The power company has said, we don't have a problem with you doing that, except here's the terms and conditions in which you have to do that. And when they received those terms and conditions, they could not afford that, they could not accept it, so that was not an alternative for them. So the only other option they have, if they cannot buy their power at a cheaper rate on the open market, is to go out of business, we can't accept those consequences in our region. Now, somebody says, well, why do you need legislation? Why are you getting involved in this? What a lot of people don't understand is that Kentucky has a territorial monopoly right. In other words, a utility has an exclusive right to sell the power to a customer within their territory. And that is the only source that customer has to get that power. So even if they can't reach an agreement with that power supplier where that supplier allows them to unilaterally go buy their power from somewhere else, they don't have any backstop. They don't have any option. So here in this case, since at that point they haven't been able to reach any agreement with the supplier and they can't by Kentucky law go buy the power from anybody else like all gas customers can do in Kentucky. If you're a large industrial customer and you use gas in Kentucky, you can go buy your power from anybody you want to. But here in Kentucky, you can't do that. So they either get an agreement to be released from that territorial right or they go out of business. So a lot of us in the West that are impacted significantly by this huge industry and these critical jobs and this economic engine that it is, started to get involved to try to bring the two parties together and work on facilitating to trying to find common ground. We've had numerous meetings, we've talked about it, and the thing that I want people to understand is that when these two smelters leave, no longer are the customers of this utility, the utility loses 70% of their base. So what's that mean? The remaining 30% are going to have to pick up the burden for that 70%. And a lot of people have said, well, your bill is raising utility rates, and it's making these utility rates, all these customers are going to have to pay higher bills because of your bill. Our bill had nothing to do with that. As soon as that contract was terminated by Century Aluminum, Big Rivers filed a rate request increase that would amount to about a 20% increase across the board to make up $74 million of lost income. That's the income they're going to lose from that smelter closing and going out of business. Our bill had nothing to do with that. It was filed much later than that. And here's a quote from the utility company. It said, electric rates are going up for those served by Kennergy, Meade County, and Jackson Purchase as a result of the smelters leaving. It's unavoidable. So remember, whether they were allowed to go on the open market to buy cheaper power to keep them in business, or if they closed, the rates were going to go up. It had nothing to do with this bill. So we got involved in trying to work a compromise to find a way that these smelters could stay open and we could preserve these jobs that are so precious. It came down to kind of two critical issues of impasse. One of them was that it was alleged that this would lead to massive deregulation of the electrical industry in Kentucky, which we absolutely don't propose, don't advocate, and this bill did not call for. And the other pivotal issue was that it said that there was some so-called incremental cost that were associated with allowing the smelters to go on the open market or to close, and those were going to be passed on to the existing ratepayers, and those existing ratepayers shouldn't have to be pay those costs. They should be paid by the industry. So we dealt with those each, and we came up with what we thought was a great compromise on those two critical points. One of them said that by virtue of using some coal severance money, and I'll explain that in just a minute, and also allowing the Public Service Commission to establish a special rate for them that could keep them in business. And that way they would be able to stay as a customer of the utility. So there would be no deregulation. And the only industry in Kentucky that could apply and comply with the law as we stated it were only these two smelters. They're the only two industries that have the load, the only two industries that have the load factor, and the only two industries that without resolution were going to go out of business. And again, we just, as a group of legislators in our area, couldn't afford for that to happen. So we got involved. We tried to work out on the deregulation issue. We put a piece of language into this bill, this alternative bill that we just filed yesterday, that would remove the issue of it being deregulation. And there's a letter on your desk from Duke Energy, the nation's largest energy supplier, big supplier in Kentucky. And they said that by virtue of our alternative bill that was filed yesterday, that they've gone from a position of opposition to one of neutrality, because they agree that it doesn't provide for wholesale deregulation, because under our bill and our proposal, the utility would continue to supply that customer. Then the second point about the utility has alleged that there's going to be millions of dollars as a result of this, because the utility is saying, well, if they go out of business, we can close some generating plants. And because of that, we don't have the cost of operating them, and we don't think that the rate base should have to pay for that. And they couldn't agree on those and some other so-called incremental costs. There's been an absolute impasse there. So we said, okay, why don't we do this? Why don't we engage and direct the Public Service Commission, that knows more about this than anybody, to be the arbiter in that situation? Let them have a hearing. The smelters can present their case. The utilities can present their case. The ratepayers can present their case. The Attorney General can present his opinion. And then the Public Service Commission would make a decision on what these extra costs are that the utilities are alleging are going to be placed unnecessarily on the residual customer base, only that 30% base that's left. What's more fair than that? Everybody would have their day in court, so to speak. And then if the Public Service ruled that there was, let's pick a number, $5 million or $10 million worth of incremental costs, Jimmy, they would then say, okay, aluminum smelters, you pay the bill. And the smelters in our bill agreed to do that. They agreed to pay those extra costs that were determined by a fair, reasonable adjudication of that issue before the Public Service Commission, so those costs would not be passed on to the residential customers, only the cost of them leaving or getting a smaller power rate, which was going to happen anyway. Unfortunately, we felt like that was a great solution. It addressed those two critical points that were out there. The utility chose not to agree to that. We're at an impasse in this issue. People say, let them solve their own problem. Well, they haven't been able to solve their own problem, and they can't solve it without this legislation because of some things I mentioned earlier about how they have no options. Now, let me just tell you what the economic impact is of leaving here without a resolution of this problem. These two smelters collectively create 3,000 direct and indirect jobs. The average job pays about $85,000 a year, counting benefits. About $85,000. Think of the purchasing power of those jobs and those wages in our communities and the taxes that they pay. I've got an economic impact statement that was done by a third party, Younger and Associates. It shows that the combined economic activity of those smelters is over $1 billion. And I asked people in my area, if we lost, in my county alone, there's about 380 of those jobs. If we lost those 380 jobs, can we replace $85,000 a year jobs in our community? I don't think so. I sure haven't seen the opportunity to do that. But anyway, we came up with a solution that would save the ratepayers money. Let me tell you, the bill without this proposed legislation, from numbers that we got from our LRC staff, the annual cost increase by virtue of the smelters closing or being allowed to buy cheaper power and stay in business would be about $513 a year. Under our proposal, it would be $400 a year. So our proposal actually allowed ratepayers to have a lesser burden. Their rates would be less than what we would be if we did nothing. And the other thing it did, it allows both the smelters and the power plants to stay in business. Nobody would lose their job. The smelters wouldn't lose any job. The power plants wouldn't have to shut down. They wouldn't lose any jobs. Coal would continue to be purchased from Kentucky coal producers. And gentleman from Floyd knows this. Let me tell you, 3 million tons of coal are presently burned, gentlemen, from these smelters. 3 million tons that could be lost in those jobs if they close. Also, the rate increase that the ratepayers would be reduced by some $24 million. The rate increase to the ratepayers, of which I'm one of, I'm on one of those rural electric co-ops. My bill's going to go up. Under this proposal, it would go up less. Also, the smelters would continue to purchase the power from the utility, so therefore there's no deregulation. And as the IOUs, the investor-owned utilities, have already identified, they're satisfied that this doesn't prompt massive deregulation. And finally, they offered above a threshold, the aluminum companies have offered above a threshold to pay 10% of their profits over that threshold back to the utility to help them reduce even further the rate burden. So I want to just leave you with this proposition. I can't in good conscience go back to the people that I'm blessed to have been honored to represent after we fail to try to, in a fair, reasonable way, help an industry that means so much to our country and so much to our state and region. And when they close, and I'm convinced that if we don't do something, because they cannot agree, they've been working for over a year trying to find common ground on this, and they cannot agree. And that's what's necessitated trying to stand by and be part of the solution and not part of the problem. But I can't go back in good conscience, gentlemen from Muhlenberg, and tell my constituents after those two close and we lose all that economic activity, say, why didn't you all do something about this? How could you let this happen? How are we going to replace those jobs? And I say, well, we tried, but we couldn't do anything about it. Sorry, we just have to find all those people somewhere else to go. They won't be buying from our stores. They won't be eating at our restaurants. They won't be buying cars. They won't be buying houses. With that kind of purchasing power, think what they can do. But let me leave you with this last comment. Think about this a minute. What if an industry tomorrow knocked on the door of our Economic Development Secretary and Cabinet and said, Mr. Secretary, I represent an industry that's seriously considering locating in Kentucky. And that industry is going to create 3,000 direct and indirect jobs, and they're going to provide an economic impact to your state of over $1 billion. Are you interested? What do you think they would say? What do you think our cabinet would do? In addition to turning a number of back wheels and cartwheels, I think they would do anything they could in terms of the economic development incentive packages that we have in Kentucky to lure those jobs here. Well, the thing I submit to you, we have those jobs here now. You've seen some of these yellow shirts walking around here the last 4 or 5 days, and those are people, real people in our communities that are here now, and we just want to try to find a way to retain them. So that's been the genesis of this whole movement. I submit to you that if you had an industry that had this kind of impact in your area, you'd be doing the same thing that we're trying to do, because we cannot replace them. And I just really abhor the fact that there's been so much misinformation shared about this and such distortion, because there's too much at stake to sit by and do nothing. And as I said, I don't want to go home at the end of the day and find out in August, which is going to happen. That's when the contract terminates and they don't have any power contract, and they close and we didn't do anything. So I appreciate your time. I think there might be a couple of other people that want to say something about this, but it's an issue of significant importance, and I think it deserves the facts. Thank you.
Recognizes the gentleman from Hopkins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is my 3rd year here. A lot of you have a whole lot more tenure than I do. But my focus since I've been here has been about protecting jobs. That's what I ran on. That's what I talk about when I go home. And that's what I have found myself in the middle of, as for the past 3 years I've tried to work with the Big Rivers Electric Corporation and try to help resolve this. The gentleman from Davies, and none of us who have been involved in these talks wanted to be a part of this. We were asked to come in and help arbitrate this because they couldn't agree. And they said, would you all come in and help us solve these problems, help us come to an agreement? And as the gentleman said a minute ago, last week we got down to 2 issues. And then we solved those 2 issues by bringing in the Public Service Commission to be the arbiter, to say, okay, you can't decide what costs are going to be. Okay, let them decide. And they both said, yeah, that's probably okay. But then, when they came back to the table, they said, well, I understand everything you said, but we just don't like this being a bill. So we're not going to agree to it. Folks, we are looking at a devastating impact for the western half of this state. From Elizabethtown all the way to Paducah. That's the regional impact. That's the geography we're talking about. You know, we all come here doing our best to try to help folks. And it's been a particular challenge when so many things, so many words have been put out by Big Rivers. You all got one of these on your desk today. Kind of reminds me of last November during the campaign. A lot of things are said, and some of them really aren't true. I know that's never happened to you guys. But to say that this bill in any form was going to increase somebody's power rates, folks, it's physically impossible. The utility already took action to raise everybody's electric rates before we ever did anything. The only thing this bill does is try to keep the jobs. People across Kentucky are going to have a catastrophic increase in their electric rates this year. For some of you that have been so busy with other issues, and I totally understand that, this may be the first time you're hearing this, but I want you to know there's going to be a catastrophic increase, 30 to 40% for some folks, increase in 1 year. That's going to happen, and we can't stop it. But what we can do is we can, with action on 211, keep 3,000 jobs from leaving, from going away. Folks, there are 3,000 people that may lose their job today, and they don't know it yet. And some folks say, well, you know, gosh, that sounds awful. I wish I could do something. The governor's office tried for 1.5 years. Their economic development office worked with these folks, and they dug in their heels. They asked us to come in 1 year ago, and we've been working tooth and nail for 1 year, gentlemen from Davies, trying to get these folks to agree. Heck, the electric utility was built for the smelters. That was the purpose. They're built right across the street from one another. It's the only reason they exist. So when they wouldn't come to an agreement, we decided what we need to do is create a bill that works with the Public Service Commission to get these two parties to do the right thing. So that we're not just sitting on the sideline going, oh gosh, that's terrible. All those folks have just lost their job. Well, who's looking out for the folks? Well, let me tell you, when I first went to Big Rivers 3 years ago, and I've met with them consistently for the past 3 years, I asked them about this rate problem. I asked them about the conflict that they had, and they said, you know what, Representative Wade, this is a quote, folks, we have no interest in lowering electric rates. Now, I was dumbfounded, but we have no interest in lowering electric rates. In fact, we want them to go up. Okay. Well, what about the smelters? Well, they're a for-profit company trying to get by. They're losing millions of dollars every month. If I had a lemonade stand losing that much money, I'd find someplace else to be too. I don't blame them. The Public Service Commission? Well, they play an integral role in this, but they won't play it if we don't carve that role out in statute and say, this is what we want you to do. Because in the negotiations, they said, well, that's not quite what we do these days, but if you all direct us to do it, we'll be glad to do it. That's what the PSC said. But Big Rivers, who's been in a blood feud with this couple of smelters for so long, they don't want to agree to anything. And so they keep putting out this poison on all of our desks, confusing the issue, misinformation, so that most of us are going, gosh, what the heck's going on with those smelters? I don't even like the word smelter. Isn't it true? But there's misinformation and people have questions. Well, guess what, though? Guess what's happened over the past couple of weeks? Just with explaining the details of our bill, the Kentucky Municipal Utilities Association, all 45 across the state, are now neutral on the bill. all I had to do was explain it. All I had to do is say, this is what the bill does. And they're like, oh gosh, that's probably pretty good. Every place from Barberville to Murray, Nicholasville to Owensboro went neutral on the bill. And then I talked to KECO. You all have a copy of this on your desk today. They even put it in red letters. Now that they said, thanks, Mr. Wade, Representative Wade, for explaining this. Now that we understand, 211 is favorable to us. And KECO asked all their judge executives to say, go ahead and tell your legislators this is okay. On top of that, LG&E and Duke Energy, these people know power better than anybody in the state. They've gone neutral on the issue. The only people that are still banging your telephones and saying don't support this bill are some of the co-ops who are still listening to their kissing cousin, Big Rivers, who's in a blood feud with these smelters. At the end of the day, we can't stop Big Rivers from creating an enormous increase in power rates. We've tried for years. I've tried for years. Lord, we have so much coal in this state. Why should we have power rates that are increasing? We ought to be the most competitive place in the world. We can't stop that. What we can do, folks, is we can save the jobs. You see, because it's not Big River's job to look out for the folks. And it's not Century's responsibility. When you get down to it, it's not even the PSC. We are the representatives of the people. We are the ones that they're going to be looking at when we go home and 6 months from now answering the question, how did you let this happen? I can tell you that the gentleman from Webster, the gentleman from Davies, and a whole team of us have been working as hard as we can just to get the information out. I know that this is kind of complex. But every time I've been able to explain it, folks have said, oh yeah, duh, that's what they're doing. That makes sense. And I feel like if we only had a little more time, there wouldn't be any controversy over this. Because everybody here is a representative of the people. Do understand that we're the only ones looking out for these folks. At the end of the day, I don't want to go home and have to say, well, gosh, I did everything we could while our coal mines are closing, while our hydraulic plants aren't servicing these factories anymore. Folks, these are coal jobs. These are steel worker jobs. These are pipe fitter jobs. These are union jobs. These are independent jobs. These are trucking jobs. And they're jobs all over the state. I came here to try to protect jobs. Kentucky's not the only state in the union that's facing this kind of situation. In fact, this piece of legislation is not even unique. Texas has already done this. West Virginia did this. The problem is West Virginia did it after they lost all their jobs. We have a chance with 211 to do this and keep our jobs. There's nothing weird or strange. This is just a method by which we can use the existing infrastructure in our state and make these two parties do the right thing so that we keep these 3,000 jobs. Thank you.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from Webster.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Ladies and gentlemen, I rise to speak in favor of this bill. You know, it's been almost 20 years since I came here, and one of the things that I learned then, because I had a lot of mentors and a lot of other people who kind of gave me some advice, and one of the things that they told me was that if you're going to be effective as a legislator, if you're going to be able to get things done, if you're going to be able to be involved in the system, The main thing that you have is your word and your credibility. You have to say what you mean and mean what you say. You have to tell people the truth. If you tell them you're going to do something, you have to do it. You can't mislead them. You can't lie to them. You know, I've only a couple of times in my 19 or so years have I really been misled by a lobbyist. I don't think they intentionally lied to me, but they misled me. And I can tell you that when those people did that, they no longer had credibility with me. It is wrong for someone to intentionally mislead or lie to a legislator or anyone else. But let me tell you that it is just as wrong for anyone who has a lobbyist who contacts my citizens, your citizens, and misleads them and lies to them in an effort to affect or change legislation before this body. That's just like lying to me or just like lying to you. And I can tell you I resent it, and I hope you do too. I'll give you one example of that. There was, as already been said, there's going to be a rate increase for the customers, and a lot of them are my constituents right there in my county that are going to get their rates increased. We know that. That's because the smelters leave 70% of the income to the utility company, then rates are going to go up. But there was some talk in this bill as it was originally proposed that said that if the smelters went to market, there would be some incremental cost. The smelters agreed to pay those costs, but there was a dispute about how much those costs were going to be. And one of the utilities, one of the co-ops that service the people in that area, came to my committee, and the CEO testified that it wasn't fair to allow those incremental costs to be placed on 112,000 consumers, the ones just that they served. At the same time they were saying that, they were convincing the other utilities and co-ops across the state to call the gentleman from Pike and the gentleman from Perry and tell them that this bill was going to raise their rates. Well, folks, you can't have it both ways. You can't come in my area and testify that this is unfair because the bill's going to put all these costs on 112,000 people. At the same time, you're getting everybody all across the state to say that it's going to raise the rates of 4 million people. It's not right. You can't have it both ways. And they've actually admitted to me that the bill as originally proposed would not raise rates on customers in Pikeville or all across the state. What they said was, well, we think that if this bill passes, then it's possible that others might want the same type of protection. And when you start doing that, sooner or later, rates may go up in the future. But that's not what they told your constituents. They misled them, they lied to them, and you should be aggrieved about that just as I am. I can tell you that I care about those aluminum smelter jobs. I also care about the jobs of the people at Big Rivers, because what's going to happen is, when these two smelters leave, they've got 3 power plants. They'll probably close 1 or 2 of those plants, and their workers are going to be laid off. I care about the jobs of the people who might work in the coal mines that supply the coal. It's about 4.5 million tons of coal that they burn there a year. I forget how many thousands of barge loads it is. I care about the jobs of the people that work at the restaurants or whatever, because they're not going to be able to, there's just going to be so much less dollars out there, so much less money, that they're not going to have that to spend. Then there are so many other jobs. I know we had the superintendent of the schools in Hancock County come in here and talk about when you have factories, what's the point of 700 or 800 people, and you lose those jobs, what does that do to the school system? It's going to devastate them. There's going to be teachers that are going to lose their jobs. There could be even administrators that lose their jobs. So this is a very serious issue, and it's one that I think it was our responsibility to try to solve this problem. At this point, we haven't been successful, but we are not giving up. I can assure you of that. I hope that we will get a chance to vote on this bill later and pass it, send it to the Senate. If not, I would encourage the governor to call a special session to address this issue, or there may be a Senate bill or something that we can add this bill to and keep this issue going, and hopefully encourage both parties to get involved and try to solve this issue because it means too much to our state. Thank you so much.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from Breckenridge 18.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We have heard a lot about House Bill 211. You've been bombarded on all sides by it. I'm sure you're kind of like me. You feel like you're a piece of butter that's been spread over too much bread. You know, everything has just been out there and you've had it all. Many times as we serve up here, you know, we come in and we try to stand for something, and when you do that, you set yourself up and you're accused of being partisan. You know, you're unbending. Then on the other side, if you're willing to try to work with someone and compromise, you're accused of selling out. So no matter what you do, you're caught in the middle. I'm sure many of you have had, as said, friends on both sides of this issue. You've had a lot of calls on both sides of it, and it's been tough. And again, I want to thank the gentleman from Davies for the work he's done. And I know it's all about keeping jobs. I mean, that's what it boils down to. I think that every one of you know that every one of these jobs has a face to it, a family connected with it. And that's why we fought so hard to try to keep them. And it's just a pity that things have not worked out. And at this point, I would urge the administration to step in and lend a hand and do what they can to keep these jobs in Kentucky. Because without them, not only my region will be hurt, but the whole state. And so again, I appreciate what you have done here. You know, and as the representative from Davis said, what would we do if this was a company that we were looking at coming in? What would we give them? You know, that it all goes back to that too. We need to think about what our existing businesses are worth to us. And I think this is one step in that process to see what we need to do, because if we can let a group like this possibly leave with these type of jobs and this many, you know, what else will this lead to? But again, thank you for the time. I appreciate that, and thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, gentleman from Breckenridge. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Butler.
Speak on the issue.
May proceed.
I'm going to take just a slightly different tack. Jobs, that's a great issue, an important issue, one that brings us together. We talk about many important issues here, but none is more important than jobs for Kentuckians. We badly need our jobs. This is an issue, I know we're divided on one thing and another. This is an issue that brings Democrats and Republicans together for jobs. It brings people from Western Kentucky and Eastern Kentucky together for jobs. These are not entry-level minimum wage jobs. These are real good, high-paying jobs. It's been mentioned the range that they're in, and there's thousands of them. We cannot afford to lose them. Our state is in a weak economic situation now. This would devastate us. Now, when I was Ohio County Judge Executive some years ago, I signed a bond issue and worked with Big Rivers when they created the Wilson plant in Ohio County. My son used to work at the Wilson plant. It is very important to Ohio County, the jobs there that's been there for many years and remain there. I don't want to lose those Big Rivers jobs in Ohio County or anywhere else. They're important. My father-in-law was a steel worker. I'm aware of the 2,500 or so jobs that will be lost if the smelters leave, the steel workers who work for them. I'm aware of the Southware plant that's located across the street from the smelter in Hancock County that works over 360 people who say that should they lose that supply of aluminum, they will be forced to move to another state. I don't want to lose those jobs or the trucking jobs that those companies use to deliver their goods to other parts of the state. I want to save those good aluminum workers' jobs. In the county I grew up in, Ohio County, we had around 20,000 population. 3,000 of those people worked in the coal mines. I have an uncle that worked in the coal mines. The miners are a major economic influence in that area. They're a major economic influence not only in Ohio County, but in Muhlenberg, Hopkins, Union, Webster, Davis, Henderson. I don't want to lose those coal mine jobs. They're good paying jobs. They've been the backbone of the economy in that part of the state for years and years and years. It's been a while since I grew up in that area. We have those same important jobs in eastern Kentucky as well with the coal miners. There's even more of them there. I don't want to lose those jobs, any of them. So we're talking about jobs at Big Rivers. We're talking about steel workers' jobs. We're talking about coal mine jobs. I don't want to lose any of those. We have been working for over a year trying to get the two parties to agree. They have not done so. We shouldn't even be here dealing with this. The two parties should have negotiated the outcome of this disagreement. They should have agreed among themselves on a plan, and that's what should happen. I suggest that other than them putting pressure on us to do this and that, I call on my legislators and the citizens that live in the affected areas to contact the officials at Big Rivers and at the smelters and urge them in the strongest way possible to get to the negotiation table and reach an agreement quickly. I also don't want the utility rates to go up on my fellow citizens in western Kentucky any more than they have to. They're going to go up substantially if nothing happens. I also call on the governor's office and the economic development cabinet to use every power that they have and all the influence they have to urge Big Rivers and the smelters to reach agreement. Let's put pressure on them to do this. It's very important. Jobs, good paying jobs. We have to save them. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from Russell, 83.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to speak on the measure, please.
Please proceed, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and ladies and gentlemen, just briefly, I want to commend the gentleman from Davies, the gentleman from Hopkins, and the others that have been involved in this discussion and these negotiations over the past several weeks. You know, I think initially many of us thought this doesn't really affect us. It only affects western Kentucky. It only affects those 2 or 3 or 4 counties and those jobs. But the truth of the matter is, as we have seen, as these discussions have progressed, it affects all of us across the state of Kentucky. And I know many of us have heard from our local co-ops concerned about parts of this bill and as these discussions have gone on. And I just commend the gentleman from Davies and the gentleman from Hopkins and the others, the gentleman from Webster and the gentleman from Butler, whoever's been involved in this, because I think they have done an outstanding job of trying to reach a resolution to save these jobs. And that is not always easy. But when you talk about 3,000 jobs. And I was intrigued by the gentleman from Davies and the statement or the facts that he had about the economic impact of these jobs, the effect of losing these jobs in that part of the state. And it's mind-boggling to think of the effect that that would have in those small counties or those rural counties of western Kentucky. And Mr. Speaker, as a follow-up to that, I wonder if the gentleman from Davies would yield to a question.
Will the gentleman from Davies 14 yield?
Yes, sir.
He will yield, sir.
Gentleman from Davies, when you talk about these jobs, the number of jobs and the economic impact and how huge that is, and it's true, I think, if there was a company knocking on our door wanting to locate here, we would be jumping up and down. We'd be having press conferences, gentlemen from Elliott, and we would be doing all of these things to welcome them here. My question is, gentlemen from Davies, has the Secretary of the Economic Development Cabinet been involved in these negotiations over the past 2 or 3 weeks, and if so, to what extent?
Gentlemen, to answer your question, not directly in the last 3 or 4 weeks. Early on, and some of the gentlemen that have testified earlier have talked about the fact that the governor's office had been involved. We've had meetings going back almost a year ago where we met with the governor, we met with the governor's staff, people from Economic Development Cabinet in an attempt to try to find a compromise to this impasse, realizing what at stake. So they were involved early on, but not in the last 3 or 4 weeks.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from Meade 27.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was going to try to remain silent in this because, as the gentleman from Davies said, we're not going to vote on the measure today. And then listening to other testimony and knowing that in my district I have over 30,000 people whose rates are going to be directly affected by this lack of being able to negotiate a contract, I felt the need that I needed to stand up for my people. Like the gentleman from Breckenridge said, sometimes you get kind of caught in the middle. Now, I don't want to see jobs leave this state, period, exclamation point. However, this is a contract negotiation. I don't think this is a legislative issue. Now think about the slippery slope that we are opening right here. Who's next? Who is next to come and say, well, we couldn't get a good contract, we're going to leave and take our jobs with us? And we'll say, oh, no, you can't do that. Well, Century Aluminum did it, and you all came up with this for them. I think what's needed in this is a mediator, because obviously it's two sides that can't agree, and that's disappointing. I'm getting green slips every day from my constituency, and you know, the three cooperatives that it's going to affect, one of them being Meade County RECC, Kenergy, and Jackson Purchase Energy. I don't know much about the other two, but I know quite a bit about Meade County RECC. The gentlemen that represent the leadership of that cooperative have been long-term friends. I've played football with them. We grew up together. Our kids have grown up together. And yet, when I hear about these contract negotiations and I'm getting their side of the story, and I go to someone who might be on the other side, they tell me, oh, no, they're lying. They're lying. Now, I have a hard time believing that, because these guys would not look me in the eye and lie to me. I believe that. Do we want to go down that slippery slope? Do we want to start intervening on contract negotiations? We have You know, you talk about the rate increase that's coming from the electric cooperatives. Well, before they can do that, it has to be approved by the PSC. Who gets to look at Century's books? You know, their stockholders maybe. That's who they answer to. We have an entire branch of government devoted to economic development, with tools to attract companies and retain jobs. Where is that economic development cabinet? Let's get them involved. Let's have a mediator. Let's have someone to bring these two sides together, because as much as it saddens me to hear that we may be losing jobs in Kentucky, and I could say they're most likely not Meade County jobs, but how does it affect Meade County? Well, we know that there's going to be a 20% rate increase on every one of my constituents' electricity bills. We know that after that increase, another increase is going to follow. So I understand your points about jobs and money and your constituents. I know you care about your constituents as much as I care about mine. But if I don't go to bat for the 30,000 plus people who are going to be hit with these rate increases, then I'm not doing my job as their legislator. I implore all of you here to please try to understand that this is a contract negotiation. This is not a legislative issue. We have a cabinet to help this state bring those two together. Let's put them to work, and let's trust the process, and let's not start going in and settling everyone's contract negotiations as a legislature. Thank you.
Chair recognizes the lady from Fayette, 79.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd really like to just visit with a minute for the freshman legislators that are here. This reminds me of when I was first elected in 2002. Central Kentucky was hit with MRLS, the Mare Reproductive Loss Syndrome. We lost 3,000 foals, thoroughbred foals. And I was very curious because I realized what happens in Central Kentucky impacts of all of Kentucky. What happens when we have 3,000 foals that aren't boarded, aren't vetted, aren't born, aren't traded, aren't sold, aren't racing, don't come for auction? What is the fiscal impact of that for the entire state, which will have repercussions across the rest of the state? And so I started asking around for some professional responses to that, and there was no reply. Shortly thereafter, in 2003, there was a problem in Paducah with the gaseous diffusion plant. And I knew the federal government was involved with that, and I looked at Western Kentucky, far, far away from me, but I realized that what happens in Paducah really has an impact on the entire state. And I was very curious because I realized that not very many of us in the central part of Kentucky or eastern part of Kentucky had any idea what the Paducah gaseous diffusion plant was. So I wrote a letter to some people and said, please put someone on this to help educate all of us in the body about what has happened in Paducah, what has happened to the groundwater, what has happened to the health of the people in Paducah, what can we do from the rest of the state to assist Paducah, Kentucky, and what is the federal government doing? Well, I didn't get any response from that. And then about 3 years after that, we had some slurry ponds in eastern Kentucky that broke down. And it was very alarming for people in eastern Kentucky because it did impact groundwater, it did impact property, and people were very much at arms in eastern Kentucky. But I didn't know if anybody else in the state was, but I was concerned, so I wrote another letter and I said, Could we please have an expert educate all of us in the body about what has happened in eastern Kentucky with the slurry ponds? How many are there? How many are vulnerable? What impact does it have on property values, on the health of the individuals, and the groundwater? And I didn't hear anything from that. And so one thing that I've always had the greatest desire to see within our body is for every one of us who sit in here to understand that when we vote on an issue, it impacts beyond our backyard. It impacts everybody in this state. And so often we forget to look beyond our own back door and realize that we're making decisions that may protect just us, but we're not looking globally where the world has gone. We've had problems in central Kentucky with the horse industry that 10 years ago was a $7 billion industry. It's now a $4 billion industry, and believe me, that has impacted how much money has been available to build schools and senior citizen centers. What happens in central Kentucky really has an impact on everyone. And I think the conversation today clearly reflects that we should all be concerned about what's happening in western Kentucky. We should all be concerned that the mines have been shut down in eastern Kentucky, and many people have been off work, because it truly has not only just a human impact, a health impact on the entire state, but it truly has a fiscal impact that makes a difference in how we can take care of the people of this state. Thank you for your indulgence. I appreciate it.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from Davies, 13.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I normally never get up and talk about anything in this legislature, but I have to make comments. I know this is funny. The aluminum industry is very important in my region. Owensboro makes their living off the people who make $80,000 a year. After they finish working, they come into Owensboro and spend at Applebee's and Old Charlie's and Ruby Tuesdays and Tumbleweed and go to the movies and go to the grocery stores and the malls. They dump a lot of money into our community. The world we live in has changed, and that's what people don't get. The middle class in every industrialized country in the entire world is shrinking, and we keep playing games. We can't do that. It's about our livelihood. We keep talking about spending in nickels. Our jobs are going overseas, and we're talking about it like it's 1950. It's not. The economics of the world has changed. We have to change to survive. In this industry, we're looking at the largest concentration of aluminum plants in the entire world is here in Kentucky. Not in the United States, but the entire world. The aluminum triangle. I just noticed it this morning. And I mentioned to the representative from Davies 14 this morning. I looked at a map, and we have a triangle of aluminum plants that impacts 1.4 million people in this state. It runs from Davies County, excuse me, I misspoke. It runs from Louisville to Logan to Webster. If you look at a map, it's a triangle, and there's 1.4 million people out of a state of 4.3. 33.9% of the population. We've got to figure out how to survive. I hear people constantly crying that things cost too much. You may have to pay 25 cents more for something if you want to hold on to the jobs. You cannot keep going to mass merchandisers who are pulling merchandise from overseas to get the lowest price and then keep crying that you don't have jobs. We have to figure out how to protect our jobs. In this situation, we're talking about 9 counties in West Kentucky. 8 of those 9 counties are coal counties. We're going to lose those coal jobs if these guys leave. We don't only lose the smelters. We got Southwire. There's another 362 jobs that uses the aluminum from those smelters. Those jobs will also lose. The electric plants will lose 2 plants, another 200 workers. This is no joke. We've got to figure out how to hold on to our jobs. And that's why we're all crying this. We have to survive. And it's not about paying $10 or $20 more per month on electric cost. You do that and you'll watch your jobs go overseas. And you won't be paying $10 more, you'll be paying $50 more. And that's a fact. Mr. Speaker, I had no intention to get up and speaking at all. But it's really a crisis. And we have to take a look at it. Thank you very much.
Chair recognizes this gentleman from Grant, 61.
Speak to rise on the bill. Each of us in this body brings a different level of knowledge on different issues. I've worked the last 16 years in the utility industry and bring a little bit of knowledge to this arena. And this is, I've wrestled with this issue greatly over the last 3 weeks. It's been a battle between heart and mind. My heart reaches out to our friends in the West, gentlemen from Davies, gentlemen from Hopkins, gentlemen from Webster. I've made myself read just about every single email we have received because those are the faces and the names behind that are affected by this issue. But my mind also weighs in on this fight. And it is because of that that I reluctantly rise and speak a little bit about this issue. Because I believe there are some long-term effects that can happen from the passage of this. There's been some changes to the original House Bill 211. And to my understanding, the latest changes carve out the investor-owned utilities, but leave the co-ops all over this state still exposed. In my district, I have a co-op that represents and serves a 180 megawatt steel mill. Under this proposal, they would not qualify. However, I believe by this time next year, if they saw that this passed, that they would be knocking on my door asking me to lower that threshold. It's a slippery slope, as the gentleman from Meade said a while ago, and we need to proceed with caution. I'm not saying we don't need to proceed. I'm saying we need to proceed with caution. I think we need to look at the market rates. Traditionally, Kentucky has been the top 3 lowest electric rate state in the union. It is a competitive advantage we've had. If we go back over 10 years, we'll see that the market rates typically have been higher. Today, they're not, due to the fracking and natural gas abundance, and it has drove rates down on the open market. I would tend to think that if this didn't happen, we wouldn't be having this discussion today. But market rates are market. They fluctuate. They're lower today, they were higher yesterday. What are they going to be tomorrow? So I will echo the sentiments of my colleague to my right here, the representative from Meade, and say that this is a slippery slope, and we need to step carefully. I will proceed with an open mind because my heart has been touched. I think we need to keep this at the table. What we don't want is a lose-lose proposition. And what I mean by that is this legislature has been put into a lose-lose proposition. If we vote it down, we've cost jobs and the finger will be pointed at us. If we do not proceed with caution and we pass this without the PSC really taking a look at this and we raise rates in the future, then the finger will be pointed at this legislature. It's a lose-lose. I just urge this body to proceed cautiously. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from Pike, 93.
Thank you, Speaker. I'm mindful today of history. I'm mindful today of our motto, united we stand, divided we fall. I listened to the debate from day one. The gentleman from Webster great chairman, there are those that feel like government has no role being involved in these matters. The great Lincoln said, "We are a government of the people, by the people, for the people." I remember the stories of my papaw, a UMWA coal miner, with John L. Lewis telling him, "Men, President Roosevelt has ordered us to go back to work." And my grandfather knew, and he told me, that if John L. didn't say, "Now men, this is your president, John L. Lewis," that was the code word. They knew to stay home and keep on striking. There's always been a role for government to be involved in the affairs of men. If we truly are a government of the people, by the people, from day one, I never wavered where I was at, gentlemen from Hopkins. And you have grown, in my estimation, this day for the stand you've taken, because it is about jobs. Now, be from Pike County, Kentucky, and lose those 2,000 coal mining jobs. We've lost them. Don't know if they're ever going to come back, gentlemen from Perry. $60,000 a year, ancillary business 6-1, and I feel for the gentleman from Davis, and I feel for my friends with the yellow shirts that comes and says these jobs pay $80,000 and $90,000. And sometimes in this life, we have situations where people do not negotiate in good faith. I do not like the lies that have been told how it's going to affect my rates in Pike County, Kentucky, from a utility that has nothing to do with what went on in the West. And you say, well, we worry about the precedent we may set. I worry about the job loss of 2,000 jobs that will never come back and will never return to this state. If we are truly working for the people of this state, and we are truly statesmen and women that work, gentlemen from Davis, we cannot sit idly by and let that take place and let that happen. I'm a little bit appalled that we ain't voting on this bill today. And for a little bit, I'd call it for a vote. I never promised not to vote on this bill. And if we get defeated, let those people back in that aluminum smelter plant know that we went down swinging and we did our best for the people. And some may say, oh, no, don't do that, Hawley. I know you're crazy, but don't do that, because we don't want to take a vote on this bill. It has divided brother against brother. It has divided friend against friend, where we stand on this issue. But I want to tell you one thing. As the chairman of Energy, I have worked tireless with India and the governor and economic development, trying to get coal sold to that country so we could save those mining jobs. Gentleman from Hopkins. And if we don't do something to bring those jobs back, I'll tell you what, here a few years ago, the gentleman from Jefferson had a big deal with Ford Motor Company. Government intervened. We stepped in. We trained the workers to save those jobs. We played a role as government officials in helping accommodate the utilization of that asset, saving those jobs in Louisville, Kentucky. I'll tell you what, I talk about the movie Lion King a lot in my speeches, the circle of life. And you look at the coal being mined in the West and the East, and you look at the jobs at Toyota, car manufacturer, and Bowling Green, Corvette, and Ford in Louisville, and you look at the smelter plants and the steel production in this state, it is a circle, all based upon the low-cost energy. It's our biggest asset as Kentuckians, that low-cost power, and they love it. But when you let an industry die and you sit idly by, and Speaker from Warren, we marched those streets. And gentlemen from Bell, we marched those streets on behalf of the working people of Kentucky. That picture's in my wall in my office. let it be said that the chairman from Pike will always stand with the people. No corporation ever cast a vote for Representative Keith Hall. Never happened. The people vote for me. The people I represent, those people that need those jobs, that feed those families, is who I am honored to be part of. I'll tell you this story. I didn't think this was my business, this deal, until I began talking about the circle. And a gentleman came in my office from Mingo County, where all those Hatfields are from. Said the McCoys are from the Pike side, Kentucky. He said, you know, Hall, I knew your papaw when he left in 1952 and caught a train to Chicago, Illinois, and took a job at Seco Steel. I said, that's correct, sir. He said, because just a few years after that, we were starving to death, too, with no mining jobs in Mingo County, and I went west, and I ended up in this smelter plant, got me a job, and fed my family. And he brought his grandchildren in to see me. And boy, that hit a nerve. Because I remember as a small child growing up in Chicago, I talked funny, had a little hillbilly accent. Why wasn't I in Kentucky with my family? It's all about jobs, gentlemen from Barron. It's about jobs. So I don't want no corporate CEO to lecture me about how government should not be involved in the affairs of people if we truly are a government of the people, for the people, and by the people. And in times when hardheads cannot get their act together, then let government step in. Let's use the power of the bully pulpit and speak softly and carry that big stick, like Teddy Roosevelt did in the early 1900s against Carnegie, Steele, and those individuals. But I just want to say last, there's been a war on coal. And if you don't think there's been a war on coal, look at the job loss. You don't think that's real? You look at the EPA record of Lisa Jackson just left, all the email aliases she had using a male name and did things contrary to the coal industry. Now I'm going to tell you one thing. We live in this hallowed hall here of the house of the people. I proudly tell everybody, this is the house of the people, floor leader. We represent the people, the common people, rich and poor, business and individual. And I think, Speaker, if we let pass this day and we don't take a stand for the working people of Kentucky and save those jobs, I'm going to make one last implore to the gentleman from Davis. Let a vote be cast this day. Take it to a vote. And let people know your yeas yea and your nays nay, and let them know where you stand. I'm not shy about that. I've never waffled from day one. And everybody was in my committee meeting today. We had a great debate for 2 hours. Big business came in there. We let the big and the small. We let citizens speak. We let corporations speak. But we aired it out and we vetted it. And I will always be that way as a chairman, because I want you to know one last thing. When I come here to Frankfort and I represent my 44,000 coal people in Pike County, my ear is filled with the voices of my people. And they've told me, you saved them jobs, Representative Hall. You saved those people's jobs because we got family working over there in West Kentucky. And I'm telling you now, if we sit by today and we don't take this opportunity, gentlemen from Davis, to cast this to a vote, go down swinging. But let's at least give a sporting chance to the people in those smelters working and sweating and laboring every day, that we did our best for those people. And we did our best to try to help those people. And in the 11th hour, we negotiated and tried to move for the sake of all Kentuckians. Thank you, Speaker.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from Perry, 84.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 1 minute. My brother from Pike, he's recently dropped. It is a war on coal. I wasn't going to say nothing. I was 2 and 3 when I came up here this year. Now I'm 3 and 4. This is not my seat. This is the people's seat from the 84th District, Mr. Speaker. Coal people, Perry and Harlan County. We've lost over 5,000 jobs, not 5,000, 2 companies, 3,000 jobs. It is a slippery slope. And if we don't wake up, we're going to lose more than that. You know, and it's time to take a stand. Brother, the gentleman from Pike mentioned Lisa Jackson. You all may not like us, the coal boys. You may not like us, but I'm going to tell you, freshmen, one thing. Come next year, when it comes coal severance time, you're going to like us because you're going to be hundreds of $millions short because it's not there, it's not been mined. This right here, does anybody know what 402 is? Water conductivity? Lisa Jackson and her people have imposed a number that comes off the runoff off top. I call it mountaintop development. We're not blessed like Central Kentucky and in the West to have flat land. We make our own. Go to Hazard. Look at the hospital. Look where Walmart Lowe's is. We make our own. The only flat land we have is in the floodplain. Gentlemen from Elliott, you know that. You've been there several times. This right here's illegal to Lisa Jackson. I don't care much for Lisa Jackson or the current administration. And that's the way it is. Because I'm a coal miner. And I'll die a coal miner. Now, I'm going to tell you something. You got 2 energy companies, and it doesn't take a rocket scientist, Mr. Speaker, to figure this out. You got one paying you $7 to $8 million a month, and the other one paying $17 million a month. In this day and age, you better wake up. You better sit down with them. You better deal with them. You better take care of them. Because if you don't, somebody else is. Nobody's come in to take care of us. But I'm going to tell you something. We shall return. You think natural gas is low now? Wait a year or 2. We will be back. It'll be a few years before severance tax money will be back. But you freshmen, remember this next year when we get in the budget and you're looking at coal severance. Coal severance don't only go to coal producing counties. 50% goes to the general fund. It goes from the far east to the far west. And I've got the paper sticking on my filing cabinet to show you the projects that it covers. You remember this. They better sit down and they better get their heads together. And I'm not allowed to say where they need to remove them. But now they better wake up and they better protect them jobs because once they leave, they're not coming back.
Chair recognizes this gentleman from Boyd, 100.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Ladies and gentlemen of the House, let's look at what this is really about. Our country was founded upon free enterprise. I think it's so ironic that we have jobs that we want to retain and use a free enterprise system, but yet the utility companies, they don't want us to use the free enterprise system. Why is that? Because they want to keep their bottom line the way that it is. Now, under my new proposed district, I've got Lawrence County, which I open up my arms to. And let me tell you what's happened down there. Our utility company has decided that in 2015, they're going to close that plant, that utility company. They're not burning Kentucky coal. They're turning back over. They're going to turn everything over to gas. They're laying off my people. They're laying off Kentuckians. They're not burning Kentucky coal. Now, let me just read you something. Let's talk about bottom lines. In December of 2011, American Electric Power was criticized for spending $28.85 million on lobbying. Ladies and gentlemen of the House, lobbying for what? Their bottom line. They have told us that if we do anything in intervention, that who's going to suffer? They are holding our citizens, constituents, hostage. If you do this, we will raise their rates. Now let me go a little bit further. Guess what was made last year by the utility company? $5 billion. $5 billion. I'd like to have that $5 billion. Now, let me just read just a little bit further, and I'll be done because I know you've heard a lot. If I can find my place here. In 2012, in 2008 to 2010, instead of $545 million in taxes, they got a rebate in that amount. They got a rebate of $485 million, and they made $5.9 billion. They also laid off 2,600 workers since 2008, increasing executive pay by 30% to $23.7 million in 2010. You tell me what's worth doing here, ladies and gentlemen of the House. Do we keep our largest aluminum manufacturer, something we can be proud of? Keep our coal burning? To me, there's not an issue here. There is not one single issue. If we want to look out for our people, we're going to say you're not going to raise our rates. We're going to make the PSC do their job. I've got litigation that I did over 13 years ago regarding franchise fees, where a utility company is not supposed to put the franchise fee back on a utility bill. Went all the way to the Court of Appeals. They agreed with me. I've got my local utility company putting it on the customer's bill, knowing that this lawsuit exists, and I have to take it back to court to enforce a judgment that was already done through the Court of Appeals. Ladies and gentlemen, I think we have to look at our citizens and stand up for our citizens. It's time. Lawrence County is losing not just 180 or 200 people from closing that plant, but just think of the other individuals, the contractors, the spin-off of that. Let's stand up to the plate and let's fight for our citizens. Thank you.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from Hopkins 10.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I will be brief. And I appreciate so much the insights and the words that have been brought tonight. But something that hasn't been discussed very much are some of the particulars in the disagreements that we've all been handed. And I want to agree wholeheartedly with the gentleman from Meade and the gentleman from Grant. I absolutely don't want the legislature involved in private negotiations between companies, once or all the time. In fact, this is not a private negotiation between two companies. Big Rivers is a regulated state monopoly. And we in no way are getting in between those guys. What this bill does with the language from the gentleman from Davis, and it's been confusing because the original bill wasn't quite cleaned up as the floor amendment is, what this language does is create the binding arbitration that the gentleman from Meade was asking for. That's what we think should happen. We want to create, using our existing structure with the Public Service Commission, binding arbitration to get these guys to do the right thing. And in that, we're not setting a precedent that anyone should be worried about. This is a bill that we all can come around and all join together and be for, because we don't create a scary or fearful precedent. Texas has already done this. West Virginia has already done this. We're using model legislation that works. You know, there was some confusion early on that somehow I had said that there was a deal between Big Rivers and the other parties. My friends, I've never said that there was a deal between Big Rivers and the other parties. What I said was we had a resolution to the problem. Confusion has reigned in this. And boy, I've talked to so many people, I hope I haven't confused anyone. But the whole reason for this bill is because we don't have an agreement with Big Rivers. And we do want to create binding arbitration to help these guys get together and do the right thing. Very quickly, I want to make sure that everybody understands that point by point, House Bill 211 with the floor amendment does not create massive cost or risk. Century Aluminum has agreed to pay all extra costs related to it, and the Public Service Commission will be authorized to make sure that all of those costs are allocated to them. There was a point that said it forces electric cooperatives to sell power and take a loss. But actually, the Public Service Commission under this legislation would make sure and keep Big Rivers whole. It would make them whole. It would make sure that ratepayers like me don't take a loss. It talks about the 112,000 families that would be hit with higher costs. Well, under this bill, we're going to reduce that rate increase by $24 million. You know the rate increase that everybody's going to get no matter what? We're going to decrease that rate increase by $24 million. Opens the door to deregulation. Far from it. We keep everybody on the grid and use the Public Service Commission to solve the problem. So, when the gentleman from Meade was talking about his buddies that he's friends with and he didn't think they lied to him, I agree. I don't think they lied to him either. I really don't. We've identified the misinformation and the source of misinformation coming from Big Rivers. The only problem is that all that information getting out there has misled many of our co-ops to think something that's not true because they really haven't read the bill. And many of us, I mean, heck, this has changed over the past 48 hours a couple of times, gentlemen from Davis. Many of us haven't seen it either, so that's why it's been so tough to get the information out there. So, let me be clear. This is misinformation, and it's been put out by a couple of folks that we know. And our friends in the co-ops, well, they've been listening to their fellow co-op, and they've trusted it, and they've been deceived. So it's our job as the representatives of the people to sift through all this, figure out what the truth is, and stand up for our people and stand up for those jobs. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The question before the body is that House Bill 211 has not been called. And gentleman from Davies.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Ladies and gentlemen, we've certainly had some very good debate on this critical subject. I would like to suggest, if it's a pleasure of the Speaker, that we take a 15-minute recess. We all need to probably take a break anyway and come back in 15 minutes and continue this discussion, sir.
Motion made and seconded that the House stand in recess for 15 minutes after that very good debate. Without objection, so ordered. House is in recess. Gentlemen from Elliott, before we go back into the orders of the day and renew our debate of House Bill 211, and that was some great debate, I believe you have something you'd like to inform the members about. Gentleman from Elliott.
Mr. Speaker, when we came back in earlier, I announced that we may be adjusting the calendar on our meeting dates. And we have made a decision, along with Senate, to not meet tomorrow. We will not meet tomorrow, but we will come back in Monday and Tuesday of next week. Monday and Tuesday of next week. Before we do adjourn tonight, I will have a time for you on what time we will come back in on Monday.
and be able to communicate that with you before we do adjourn tonight. But we will not meet tomorrow. We will meet on Monday and Tuesday. We'll move tomorrow to Tuesday, correct? So before we do leave, Mr. Speaker, hopefully I'll be able to I will communicate a time when we will come back on Monday. Speaker, I would yield back to you, sir.
Chair recognizes Gentleman Davies.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Ladies and gentlemen of the House, I wanted to first say that I've been overwhelmed by the debate that we've had on this subject tonight. This has been, in my tenure here, this has been some of the most informative, genuine, thorough debate on any issue that I've ever been associated with. And I want to, first of all, thank you all the members of this prestigious body, the People's House, for standing up for us in the West primarily, where this is a crisis, where we're facing the loss of these jobs and the loss of this economic impact. And I want to thank you all for your overwhelming support. I mean, I am really moved by the compassion and the interest and the serious concern that this issue represents. And it's Democrats and Republicans that have done that. And I want to thank you all for that, because let me tell you, the people that aren't here today, that are depending upon our responsible action and our recognizing how important this is to them and their families and our economy, you've stood up for them. And that means so much. But I stood up here earlier when we started this debate, and I said that we weren't going to take a vote on this today. And the only thing we have in this body at the end of the day is our word. That's the only thing that we have. So I'm going to honor my word, but I said we weren't going to take a vote on it today. And I hope the people that have been listening to this great debate, that are involved in this dispute, heard this debate tonight. Now, we've got a weekend coming up. I hope they're going to take that weekend and sit down and get this issue resolved. There's too much hanging in the balance for us to not take action if they don't. So I hope they heard the message that was conveyed tonight and the comments that were made, and they'll go over the weekend and they'll sit down and be mature adults and find a resolution to this issue, because it's there. And those workers and those economies and the people of Kentucky deserve that attention, and they deserve those results of finding compromise on this. So we're going to come back Monday, and it's a new day, and we still have time to visit that, but we're going to hope that that happens over the weekend. And if not, this is still open. We're not going to be demeaned by this. We're going to maintain our vigilance, because there is too much at stake to not be involved and to not find an answer. I hope the parties will find an answer over the weekend. If not, Monday is a new day. But I'm going to honor my word, as I said, and we won't vote on it tonight. Thank you all for this discussion. Thank you for your interest. I appreciate it.